We're gonna start with some sound theory, unless you guys happen to know about how how sine waves and overtones work. Alright, well, I'll cover it. Yeah. So, all sounds are made up of frequencies of sine waves. The sine wave, just to... that there's a sine wave, it's a pretty simple thing because it only contains exactly one frequency. When you have a more complex waveform, like that, you can hear it's a lot harsher than a sine wave. Like a sine wave is very, very, very mellow. That is because it does not have any overtones, or at least not any that like actually matter. If you add another sine wave on top of... So, when I say adding sine waves, what I mean is audio like this, it oscillates around like a line. This line here, the center line. And you can think of when it dips down like this, that's negative, and when it crests up like this, it's positive. So this is the negative zone, this is the positive zone. When you add two waveforms together, and we should be able to see this on this oscilloscope here. Let me just do something real quick. Let's remove this one. So here you can see... Oh, actually, I know what to do. There we go. So here you can see just a regular old sine wave. And if I add a sine wave with twice the frequency, just so that we can see it in the resulting waveform. It's clipping, it's getting cut off here, so I'll lower the volume of both of them. There we go. So you can see we add the two up. We've got a wave that's going up and down twice for every repetition, and we got a wave that's kind of cresting up and down once for every repetition. And what you'll notice is that this tone sounds different from a pure sine wave. We're going to cover FM synthesis a little bit later, but this is just additive. We're just taking two different tones and adding them together to make something that sounds different, right? Like that is... it sounds like one note, right? But it is two different frequencies that are being played. And the overtone series is... So here I have this waveform at twice the frequency. And you can also have it at 3 times the frequency. And 4. 5. And the overtone series is just integer multiples of the bass tone. And every waveform is made up of individual sine waves. You can decompose every single waveform that you can think of into individual sine waves. Now, in Picotron, or really any synthesis type of thing, This is kind of a problem because, like, if I want to make a really complex sound, I have to... here, actually, let's... If I want to make a complex sound, I need to add a lot of sine waves together. And something you'll notice here is as I add these, each with the next overtone in the series and each with half the volume, it starts to approximate a saw wave, right? It's down, 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 and then it jumps right back up. And that kind of gives us a hint for how we can get more complex overtones without having to add more oscillators, which is just change the shape of the wave. And when you are trying to make certain sounds with your waveforms, the shape of the wave can tell you a lot about how it will sound. So if it looks like a perfect sine wave, of course it's going to sound very mellow, neutral. There's no harsh corners, there's no sharp jumps, it's very, very smooth. If you, say, use a triangle wave, you can see, like, it's still pretty smooth. There are some corners here that give it a little bit of character. And then as we move over to the saw wave, and here you can listen to this, one of these... first of all, it gets asymmetrical, right? Like, a sine wave is very symmetrical, right? Like, this takes as much time to get over here as it does to loop back around and get to here. But a triangle wave, on the other hand, very asymmetrical. It takes a long time to get all the way up here, and then a very short time to get back down here. And you can hear as that gets more and more asymmetric, and you have a higher and higher, like, jump in here, or a steeper jump, I should say. It gets more and more kind of nasally. So, smooth, round sounds are very mellow, and very sharp sounds are very nasally. And you can also see this in square and pulse waves, like this one here. So this is a square wave. I'm going to turn that down just a bit. And then as you go closer and closer to a pulse wave, it gets very, very nasally. And that means that the very low frequencies are being suppressed and the very high frequencies are really coming out. Like, you have lots and lots of very intense overtones. There are other ways of adding complexity to this sound wave. And one of them is frequency modulation. So here we have a carrier, we have a modulator, and I'm going to set this to just 0 for now. So this sine wave is moving at a constant speed, if you will, right? This oscillation here happens once every... whatever the frequency of the waveform is. As we modulate this, modulation just means basically changing it over time. So this is another sine wave, and we're going to be modulating it. We're gonna be modulating the carrier's frequency by the sort of like vertical position of this wave. And since they're both going at the same frequency, this is going to create a regular wave, a wave that repeats the same way every time. So if I add this in, and we can watch this this wave over here. And I think this is probably better demonstrated if I do this modulator, this frequency modulator, at half the frequency, so that we can really see how it affects this waveform here. And you can see it's going back and forth between very, very fast pulses and a very slow pulse, because this is changing the frequency of the carrier. And you can also see that this is, like, you know, as we increase the frequency modulation here, you know, it deviates from a sine wave, and you start getting places where it's changing more frequently, it's less smooth, and you have places where it just kind of hangs out for a little while and it's more smooth. And so adding frequency modulation changes the timbre and it gives you more overtones. And kind of a standard way of making something feel kind of like an instrument is adding an envelope to... Let's just cover the envelopes real quick. You may have seen this ADSR. That is attack. Here, let me set this up real quick. So that's attack. That's how long it takes for it to get to max volume. Here, let me... We have delay, which is... Or it's not delay. Decay, which is how long it takes for it to get to... Or after it's at max volume, how long it takes for it to get to the sustained volume. We have sustain, which is just the volume that you want it to stay at when you are... when you're holding the note, right? So if I set this to right about here, it starts loud and then sits at about 75. Yeah, if you want to skip the ASDR thing, then that's fine. All right, well, so yeah, using an ASDR. I have it in my mind as ASDR. It's ADSR. If you apply an ADSR to a frequency modulation node, then of course what'll happen is it starts with a more nasally timbre and then mellows out into just a pure sine wave, because we are decreasing the volume of the modulator, and therefore we are decreasing how much we modulate the carrier by. And that's one of the ways that you can add complexity to your audio. I think that it just doesn't really sound good when it goes all the way back to a sine wave, especially when the modulator is only half the frequency of the carrier, because it sounds like it's jumping up by an octave, it's increasing to twice the frequency, because it kind of is. When the modulator is at half frequency like this, the period over which the waveform repeats is twice as long as the frequency at which the carrier repeats. So once you no longer have a modulator, then it's just the carrier's sound coming through, which is twice the frequency of the modulator, so it sounds like it's going up an octave. So what I like to do to remedy that is, if you right-click on any of these knobs here, you can change the number that it ends at. Hello. So I like to raise that just a little bit, so we never stop modulating the carrier. We would just continue to modulate it by some amount. And you can make some nice instruments with just this setup alone. Let's turn up the release for this.
There we go. Now my mic should be working.
Okay. And then there is another thing we could do. Yeah, I am actually recording this right now. So
maybe I should be muted, actually.
Maybe. If you have questions, you're welcome to ask them, but... another way that you can modulate a carrier is with amplitude modulation. So if frequency modulation changes the speed of the carrier wave, then amplitude it would be amplitude modulation, but it's also called ring modulation for whatever reason. Can FM rub off of each other? You can modulate with more than just one FM modulator. Like, you can add another oscillator to your modulator. And, I don't know, give it a different frequency, like 3/2. And that, too, adds complexity to your sound. And that does remind me of something that I would like to point out, which is that when you have two oscillators interacting like this, not even like frequency modulation. Like if I just put another oscillator here, and let's give them a little bit of timbre just by changing the waveform here, and I make one of these a slightly different frequency, then you can get more complexity. And this complexity evolves over time, so it's not just the waveform itself changing, the waveform itself having a different timbre, but the timbre shifts over time because these two things are interacting and gradually evolving as the sound goes on. And you can see that here, where these two waveforms add together into something that's constantly shifting like this. If you overdo it, it just kind of sounds bad. So it's a subtle effect that you want. And I also find this to work really well with wide instruments. So if you set the panning, I'm gonna have to move this one out of here. Yeah, I'll cover that in just a second. Where are we at? The bend is wrong. There we go. So if you set it to be a wide instrument and you have each of these things panned differently to each other, like one's in the left ear and one's in the right ear, and you have one of them bent a bit, it also creates depth. And yes, I am recording this. So yeah, back to your question, actually, which is modulating the modulators. And yes, you can do that. Again, it adds complexity. I don't think it adds as much interesting complexity as adding other waveforms or messing with intention with the waveform shape. But it is totally doable. So, like, let's say... Oh. Yeah, that's right. You can like mix these two things together, where you have different waveforms that are being frequency modulated, and you can get different sounds from that. I will note that, interestingly enough, the frequency modulation is the sine wave is not really the most basic form of it, unlike with carriers where that's one frequency. So if you increase this wave knob here until it's a triangle wave, it actually tends to have a mellower timbre than if you use a sine wave. And I don't recommend you really push this wave up for frequency modulation, and I'll both demonstrate and explain why. So, as you go further up, you start to get into the saw wave, and then you get this sort of thrumming sound. And as you go further... Oh, let me set the panning back to middle, actually. As you go further, and you start to get into the square waves. And then once you get into the pulse waves, things start breaking. And there's a good reason for that, which is that the modulator spends more time in it would be the negatives, more time in the negatives than it does in the positives. So it's being slower more of the time than it's being faster. In other words, the frequency is going down, so this is actually changing the note. Personally, I don't really like frequency modulation where you have sharp jumps like this. I don't think it tends to sound good, and it responds to the sine wave in very strange ways, where you get those thrumming sounds. But it is definitely a tool that you can use if you want to use it. Alright. And modulator on modulator. Yeah, and you also get thrumming sounds from that, and it can change the pitch. It's still doable. It's an option. Personally, I think it is better to add additional oscillators to a modulator than it is to modulate the modulators. At least when it comes to frequency modulation. Which brings us to ring modulation, or amplitude modulation. It's the same thing, except it multiplies one wave with the other, instead of changing the time. So... what is the best way to demonstrate this? Huh. I didn't realize that, but anyway. Let's put this at twice the frequency. And you can see as it crosses the 0 point on this wave, it also crosses the 0 point on this wave. You cannot change that because, of course, it's multiplication. And ring modulation is just another nice way of adding complexity to a waveform. And again, you can change the bend on it, change the frequency slightly, and get something that evolves over time. Here, let's oh yeah, that's another thing about ring modulation. It generally tends to decrease the volume of your waveform, because this goes from -1 to +1, which means that anything that isn't 1 or -1, which is going to be probably most of whatever waveform you're using for the ring modulation is going to be some fraction of full volume. So it does tend to decrease the volume. And again, this is another thing you can control with ADSR envelopes. It's not great, because as you decrease the volume of the ring modulator, it starts multiplying everything by 0, and then you get nothing. So this controls the volume. Now, a neat trick that I like to do with ring modulation here is... Is it ring modulation that I do this with? Yeah, okay. Is add an extra oscillator here. And this is a particular setup where I'm going to set the tune way down to -128, so it barely does anything with the wave. It's just stuck at one part of the wave. And I'm going to set the wave all the way up to this incredibly aggressive pulse wave. Let's set the bend to 0 because you don't need that. And what this does is this gets added to this waveform here, and this creates a DC offset, or in other words, it just moves it down. Hello. Yeah, it just moves it down. So if I decrease the amplitude of this, now that I have this all the way at volume 0, it's not reducing the carrier all the way to 0, because of course it has this sort of -1 built in there. And that makes ring modulation a little bit more useful, I think. What else we got? Filters. Yeah, filters are another useful tool. So if we have just kind of a base... Oh, sorry. That was a mistake. Okay, cool. If we have just a the waveform like this, you know, just close to a saw wave so we can have some timbre. If we put a filter, let's not put it there, let's put it on the top level here. If we put a filter, I guess I want it here. I don't know, here's the fine place. If we put a filter on any sort of waveform, really, the low frequencies, that's all the sine waves with the lowest of frequencies, if you turn up the high pass, that's what this is, so it's a high pass filter, you will start to remove those lower frequencies until you have pretty much nothing but overtones, and the really high frequency overtones at that. And the inverse is true for the low pass. It will remove the higher frequency overtones and mellow out the sound. And what resonance does is it amplifies frequencies around where you start cutting off high frequencies with the low pass filter. And using this, you can actually, here, let's turn this way down because it's going to be kind of grating. But using this, you can actually hear the individual overtones in the carrier. I don't know if you could hear that, especially if you don't know what to listen out for, but yeah, they're there. Is there anything else worth covering? We could go over some just basic ways of making certain instruments, if anyone's interested in that. All right. So let's start with a pretty easy one, which is kicks. Like kick drums. There is not a whole lot to them. They are basically just rapidly descending tones that don't last for a very long time. So I'm gonna go ahead and have my volume envelope here. Let me just. Oh, and also I'm gonna turn off the relative tuning so we just get something absolute, no matter what note we tell it to make. So there's our like really brief kind of impulse there. And just have the decay turned really low and no sustain whatsoever. Now, if we decrease the pitch really quickly as well, so let's put that at like 8 there, 8 decay, you get something resembling a kick. It's not very impressive as far as a kick goes. There are a couple ways that you can make it more interesting. The easiest way is probably to change the waveform, so you get something a lot more grittier with all those extra overtones. I don't tend to turn this up very high, but if you want something really aggressive, I think it's a perfect way to do that. So I'll just leave it at sort of this mostly triangle wave here. And the other way to really give it emphasis, make it really feel like a percussive instrument, is to add some noise to it. If you just click on WT0 here, then it switches over to a noise thing. And then 2 and 3, as far as I know, are unused. You can probably mess with them in code, but the instrument editor does not give you any way to work with them. So anyway, let's put another envelope on this one. And this one's going to be really short, just a quick little burst of noise. And that gives it more of a kick drum personality, like something's actually hitting the kick drum and it's not just a thud. What else we got? Pads, I like to do them as wide instruments with a couple different oscillators going on. Let's add some frequency modulation at half the frequency because that always sounds nice. I guess I should probably really quickly cover wide. So if you're not doing wide, then it's a mono instrument. That means that it's just centered. You don't get any difference between the left and right ears. It's not stereo. If you do wide, here, let's I have the perfect way to demonstrate this actually. So this will be twice the frequency. Yeah, okay. So this is mono. And if you do wide, then for all of your base level nodes, so it won't do it for this, it won't do it for this, but for all of your base level nodes, you get this option of panning. So narrow, wide. And you can get different sounds in both ears. Yeah, so for pads, I like to have some width in it, so you can, you know, kind of fill out the aural space. And I like to give them a little bit of interest in the waveform shape itself. And I definitely like to... Oh yeah, let's set this back to normal actually. I definitely like to add some pitch bending to it. In all the places, really. Oh. Ah. And you have a sound that's kind of complicated and evolving and fills out the space. Hello. And let's add some ASDR to the frequency modulation so that we cut out some of the higher frequency overtones as the instrument goes on. And let's even add some sustain and release in there. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, the sound effects editor doesn't have any support for playing more than one note at a time. So pads are kind of difficult to preview. And of course, you can also mess with like the waveform that gets used if you want extra timbre or want to change the sort of timbre you get. Snares are an interesting one. You kind of have to model it. So either you need to just kind of work with what you have, or you need to really model after a real snare drum, because snare drums are kind of hard to replicate. But as you can imagine, you know, it's mostly noise, so if you switch over to a noise node... Oh, there they go. And you, you know, make sort of a brief decay. And it's a bit too hi-hatty, so we'll turn the frequency down. Now that's kind of lame, right? It doesn't have much oomph to it. One of the ways that you can address that is to so something to note about the ADSR envelopes is that they are linear. They will linearly increase volume in the attack phase, linearly decrease it in the decay phase, and linearly decrease it in the release phase. But we do not perceive sound to be linear. Like, if we add, you know, if we're at like 10 volume, and we add 10 more volume, then, you know, that's a little bit louder, right? If we're at 46 volume, and we add 10 volume, it's almost indistinguishable. So what we can do is we can give it exponential decay, right? So we multiply it by the ADSR envelope, and then we do it again. So one in the base node, one in the carrier. And it's a little bit more punchy like that. I don't think it helps very much, but it is definitely an improvement. And another way that you can do that is using the data envelope. So you can say, like, I want it to be really loud here, and then I want it to kind of taper off as we go further and further along. And let's set the speed to something like 4. Blurp it 2. And data is really, really handy when you're doing percussion instruments. Gives you a lot of control over how the sound evolves, and how it evolves in the first couple, like, tens of milliseconds is very important. So one of the things that we can do to punch up this snare is add another envelope here. Let's do a data envelope, and we're going to make it higher frequency at the very start. Higher frequency at the very start. There we go. This is 17. And in fact, let's make yeah, so we'll dip the frequency down to something very low just before we go back to something kind of in the middle. And it, again, adds more punch. Oh, yeah, okay, see you later, Squibble. And another thing we can do to add more punch is we can take a page out of the kick, which is just have sort of a low frequency sine wave that decreases in frequency as time goes on. Why can't I hear that? And now it's really punchy. And there's a number of other tricks that you can do, but I won't be going over them. This is kind of the basics of how to make a snare sound punchy. You can also add in a sort of metallic sound to make it sound a bit more like an acoustic snare. Are people talking in the... okay. And metallic sounds in frequency modulation are interesting. Let's yeah, there's our sine wave. If we add a frequency modulator and we set the the frequency to be something ridiculous with like a couple of prime numbers in there to make sure that it sounds absolutely nothing like the carrier, then you get a very metallic kind of sound. Like it's a bunch of kind of random frequencies just smushed together. Let's go ahead and add another envelope to this. And give it a specific frequency. And we can add our original snare back in. And tone this down a little bit because maybe even increase the frequency. Just play around with it a bit. Decrease the... In fact, you know what? I'm gonna set this to be some even more ridiculous ratio, something even higher frequency. The modulator here. Oh wait, what? Oh. Probably not my best snare, but you get the idea. Hi-hats are kind of interesting, because there's sort of a mix of noise and a waveform, but the waveform is like very messy, very atonal, because it's mixed in with all that noise. So the way that I like to do that is to modulate a regular old sine wave or any other kind of wave carrier using noise. And this is kind of easy to get wrong. It's very sensitive, but the gist of it is as you modulate it with more noise, the sort of regularness of the sine wave becomes less predictable. Yep, okay, see you later, modem. So the frequency of the carrier becomes more and more erratic as you add more frequency modulation noise. And you generally want this to be a very high frequency because it's a hi-hat. Yeah, and if of course you want it to decrease very quickly, it's a hi-hat. It's gonna mute very, very fast. And of course, it helps to just add some noise in there because, yeah, it makes it sound more like a hi-hat. And you can hear that sort of, like, just that tiny little bit of metallic cling to it. Without this oscillator in here, it's just, which is good enough for most things, and it gives you a very, very clean hi-hat sound. But if you want it to sound a little bit more acoustic, you can add in the carrier the waveform carrier modulated by the frequency modulator, or the noise frequency modulator. That is everything I really wanted to cover. So, any questions? Things you might want to know about? Sounding like a no. The retrigger button. Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. So if I have like a, this kind of, and I'll play around with the volume here. Let's see if I can. Well, first let's demonstrate what happens when you don't have the retrigger on, which is, yeah. So Picotron expects whenever you have a note that keeps going like this, that it means that you want to sustain it, right? You want it to just keep going. This isn't useful for percussion instruments because they don't work like that. So if you turn on retrig, it'll do it every single note. Where's there? there. Yeah. Alright, is that all? I think that's all. And I'm realizing now that in OBS I probably don't have any sort of say ABS? OBS. I probably don't have any sort of sound suppression, so the people who just came in are probably going to be making a lot of noise on the recording. Whoops. Alright, I guess I'll wrap it up here.